All right, strap in, everyone. We're going deep today.
Deep into what exactly?
Russian intellectual thought. And, the weird ways occult and esoteric ideas have, well, kind of snuck in there.
Not exactly light reading, I take it.
You got that right. We're talking Alexander Dugin's The Templars of the Proletariat. Dense stuff.
Dugin. He's the guy known for some, shall we say, controversial views.
That's one way to put it. But today, we're here to unpack it all. Help you navigate the twists and turns of his arguments, the historical bits and pieces, the philosophy.
And maybe come out the other side with, hopefully, some new insight into Russian history and thought.
Exactly. Be prepared, though. We're dealing with some mind-bending stuff. National Bolshevism, for one, and its possible connections to esoteric traditions.
Sounds like a wild ride.
Oh, it is. We'll even touch on figures like Ernst Jünger and even, believe it or not, David Bowie.
Wow. A real eclectic mix. I'm intrigued already.
One of the first things that kind of jumps out from the book is Dugin's take on Bolshevism. He says there's this whole metaphysical dimension to it, goes beyond the historical stuff, the political stuff.
He's saying Bolshevism, especially in Russia, wasn't just a political thing. It was a spiritual phenomenon.
Okay, I'm following. So more than just changing governments, it's about what? Changing consciousness.
Right. He even uses this term, left esotericism, to describe this mixing of revolutionary politics and, occult or esoteric beliefs.
Left esotericism. I'm going to need a little more on that. What does it actually look like in practice?
Imagine a search for spiritual change, transformation even, but through really radical social and political upheaval. Revolution, basically.
Yeah.
Especially one as violent and transformative as the Bolshevik Revolution.
So like a traumatic kind of spiritual awakening.
Exactly. Traumatic spiritual realization, to use Dugin's words. And that idea is key to understanding his whole concept of national Bolshevism. He sees it as this, a uniquely Russian thing, deeply rooted in the country's history and spirituality.
Okay, yeah. Russia has always had that kind of mystical element to it, like a sense of destiny, a connection to something bigger.
Absolutely. Dugin actually traces those mystical and what we call eschatological currents throughout Russian history. He looks at groups like the Old Believers. They saw themselves as, protecting the true faith. And then there were the Judaizers who wanted to reform Russian Orthodoxy.
And he brings up the whole Moscow as the third Rome idea, right? After Constantinople fell, Russia inherited this special spiritual mission.
Exactly. And he ties that into the katechikon concept, the force that holds back the Antichrist, stops the apocalypse. Dugin suggests that the Russian Tsar, and by extension the Russian state, were seen as fulfilling that role, keeping chaos at bay.
So to understand Russia's history, you got to understand this belief in its destiny, its spiritual mission. It's what drives their political and cultural aims.
That's Dugin's argument, and it leads to one of his, most debated ideas, national Bolshevism.
Okay, so let me get this straight. How can you be both nationalist and Bolshevik? Don't those kind of clash? Nationalism's all about the nation, and communism's international.
Yeah, it seems paradoxical, right? But for Dugin, national Bolshevism is this fusion of, those radical communist ideals, but with a really strong sense of Russian nationalism and Eurasian identity. It's about bringing the lands of the old Russian Empire together under, not just communism, but a shared culture and history.
So not just about class struggle, but forging a whole new Eurasian civilization, blending communist and nationalist principles.
Exactly. And that's where Dugin makes a distinction between national Bolshevism, his version, and national communism. He uses that term for movements in the former Russian Empire, where different ethnic groups saw the October Revolution as a chance to create their own nations.
So national communism was more about, splitting off, right? While national Bolshevism, for Dugin at least, was about this big pan-Eurasian vision.
Precisely. And he uses the life and work of this Soviet author, Marietta Shiginian, as an example. He says her story shows how a typical national Bolshevist might evolve.
Which ties into his whole idea of this, recurring archetype in Russian thought, the nationalist revolutionary, the guy who wants radical change but is also searching for some kind of deeper truth.
Exactly. He draws on the work of historian Alexander Etkind, who sees this archetype throughout different periods of Russian history, like the Decembrists, those guys who rebelled against the Tsar back in the 19th century, and the poets of the Silver Age. Super interesting period, early 20th century, tons of artistic and intellectual energy. This archetype, this figure, keeps popping up.
So he's weaving together all these things, right? Political ideas, historical movements, even art and literature into this big narrative of Russian thought.
And what's even more, I guess, challenging, is his argument that the values of the Silver Age, even though some late Soviet intellectuals embraced them, were totally at odds with Western liberal norms. It complicates the idea that the Soviet Union falling apart was a win for Western liberalism.
He's saying there's something deeper going on, something that comes from Russian history, their culture, and this unique spiritual and intellectual archetype.
Right. And things get even more radical when Dugin starts talking about aggression from a, well, metaphysical point of view.
Okay, now we're getting into the good stuff. Most people think of aggression as a bad thing, something to avoid, something to squash. But Dugin, he flips it,
He
right?
does. He says aggression isn't just about violence or hostility. It's part of our very being.
Yeah.
This drive to push beyond limits, to transform ourselves, to expand. It can destroy, yeah, but it can also create.
So aggression, in its pure form, it's about self-assertion, pushing possibilities and striving for something bigger.
Exactly. And this is where things get, well, controversial, because he connects this idea to terrorism. He's arguing that terrorism at its core is about trying to break free from a world that's constantly trying to get rid of aggression, impose a kind of universal morality.
Whoa, you don't hear that every day.
It's definitely provocative.
Yeah.
And that's Dugin for you. He challenges conventional thinking and explores ideas that, well, a lot of people would find unsettling, maybe even dangerous.
So if aggression is this force, this fundamental thing, and terrorism is like its extreme form, where does it all lead? What does Dugin see as, the ultimate expression of it?
He introduces this concept of the subject without limits, a being that totally embodies this drive for expansion, transformation, pushing beyond any and every boundary, any limit. He suggests that this could even lead to a final confrontation, like the end of times, a clash of order and chaos that decides the fate of humanity.
Wow, okay. We've covered a lot. Metaphysics of Bolshevism, the catacon, the nationalist revolutionary. Now we're talking about aggression as this metaphysical force and the subject without limits. My head's spinning.
And that's just the beginning.
Well, let's take a moment to let all that sink in. When we come back, we'll delve into some of the other figures and ideas Dugin talks about. We'll be looking at Ernst Jünger, the symbolism of the child and the doctrine of the star, as seen by, well, folks like Aleister Crowley and David Bowie. Okay, so let's get back into Dugin's world here. He seems really interested in this guy, Ernst Jünger, a German author, kind of part of this conservative revolution thing. What's the connection to Dugin?
It's Junger's idea of total mobilization that Dugin latches onto. It's not just about changing the government or whatever. It's a total societal shift, like getting ready for war, but the goal is building a whole new civilization.
So a mobilization that goes way beyond just politics and economics, affects everything.
Exactly. And for Junger, the key to making it happen is the worker, the Arbeiter. He could be a heroic figure, embodying that spirit of total mobilization. Dugin takes that idea and runs with it, but specifically for the Russian worker.
It's like he's romanticizing the worker, turning them into this mythical figure. Why the Russian worker specifically, though?
Dugin thinks the Russian worker is special. Their connection to the land, all the hardship they've endured, their struggles. He sees this unique potential for them to become that kind of Jungerian hero.
So not just any worker, it's got to be Russian. Like they're carrying some historical, spiritual burden.
Yeah, you could say that. And Dugin even links it back to ancient myths. He compares the worker's struggle with, raw materials and stuff to this old Indo-European myth about a peasant battling a serpent.
Hold on, factory work is like fighting mythical serpents now? That seems like a bit of a stretch.
I know, it sounds strange. But remember, with Dugin, there's always this symbolic layer. For him, this struggle is part of this ancient cosmic battle, good versus evil, order versus chaos. It's about preserving whatever's left of this, this sacred solar civilization he thinks we've lost in the modern world.
So it's not just about guys working in a factory. It's tied into this whole epic story about, cosmic struggle and preserving ancient wisdom.
Exactly. And that idea of holding on to something old and valuable, it leads us to another big theme for Dugin, the importance of children and the role of matriarchy.
He gets pretty intense about the way kids are treated today, doesn't he?
He does. He sees kids as representing pure potential, a connection to something, more spiritual. He even uses this harsh term, spiritual genocide, to talk about how modern society forces them to conform, to become materialistic, cynical, like their souls are getting crushed.
It's like our education system, consumer culture, all that stuff. It just churns out these mini adults, no wonder, and no spiritual connection.
That's the idea. And he contrasts this with what he calls matriarchy, a society where feminine values are important, nurturing, intuition. That would be better for kids' spiritual growth.
So it's not just about women running things, it's about a whole different way of seeing the world, a more feminine way.
You got it. And for Dogen, losing that, the shift to a patriarchal system, it was a disaster for traditional societies. It led to suppressing the feminine, devaluing things like empathy, connection to nature.
So he feels a sense of loss, like he longs for this harmonious past where those values mattered.
Absolutely. And that longing, that yearning for a golden age when things were more spiritual, more balanced, it comes up a lot in his writing. It's like he's trying to find something precious that we've lost.
Speaking of quests and spiritual stuff, that brings us to the doctrine of the star, something Dogen gets into by looking at, of all people, Aleister Crowley and David Bowie.
Now we're getting into the really esoteric side of things. Crowley, the occultist, and Bowie, the rock star. They seem totally different, but Dugan finds a common thread. They both believe in the power of transformation within each person.
Crowley with his thelema, Bowie with his constantly changing personas. They're both saying we're all stars in our own way.
That's it. They're pointing toward this idea of the absolute beginner, a chance for radical change, to break free from all those rules and expectations society throws at you.
So it's about tapping into this inner power, becoming something greater than what society wants you to be.
Yeah, but Dugan is careful to say this isn't the same as all that New Age positivity stuff. The doctrine of the star is, well, way more radical, maybe even a little dangerous.
It's not just about thinking happy thoughts. It's about facing your shadows, the unknown, going through a real transformation, like alchemy.
Right, and this whole transformation thing isn't just for individuals. Dugan applies it to whole societies, too. He uses this term Lyapunov time to describe those periods of chaos and unpredictable stuff that can lead to huge changes.
Okay, Lyapunov time. I'm lost. Physics isn't my strong suit.
Think of it like stretching a rubber band. Keep pulling, eventually it snaps. Systems, people, societies, they all have a breaking point. Lyapunov time is when a system hits that point, it becomes chaotic. You can't predict what'll happen.
So it's like a crisis point. The old way breaks down and something new can come out of it.
Exactly. And this is where Dugan introduces one of his most, well, provocative and fascinating ideas. The magical fascist.
Now that sounds intense. Who is this magical fascist exactly? What's their role in all of this?
It's not a literal fascist like a politician. It's more of an archetype, a figure that represents all those dark, aggressive impulses that Dugan thinks liberal society tries to bury and suppress.
So he's saying that trying to get rid of conflict, forcing a single morality on everyone, that's what actually creates the magical fascist.
It's like a backlash, When you try to repress, it comes back even stronger. And he links this figure to the writings of the Marquis de Sade. He sees something in Sade's work, a warning about how this psychic fascism could come from the very heart of liberalism.
That's pretty dark. Does Dugan offer any alternative? A way to escape this whole cycle of repression and then explosion?
He does. He talks about something called the aquatic regime. It's a stage in magical development where you kind of dissolve your fixed identity. You become more fluid, adaptable.
Letting go of all those rigid structures, inside and out, just going with the flow, transforming.
Exactly. He sees this as a way to get beyond the limits of the material world, to reach a higher level of consciousness and spiritual, realization. It takes courage, facing the unknown, but it's a potential way out of that cycle of violence and repression that Dugan thinks is messing up the world.
Sounds kind of like spiritual anarchy, right? Rejecting all those fixed forms and ideologies.
In a way, yeah. It's about embracing the mystery of existence, its constant change, instead of trying to control it or stuff it into neat little boxes.
And this is where he brings in the work of Jean Parvulescu, a Romanian author, writes about esoteric stuff, conspiracies, all that.
Yeah, Dugan sees him as a, quote, herald of an invisible empire. Someone who represents this occult elite, working behind the scenes of history, manipulating things in secret.
So now we're back to secret societies and shadowy figures controlling the world.
Dugan really loves this idea of a hidden world running alongside ours, a world of occult forces that most people are completely oblivious to.
It's a lot to take in, that's for sure.
It is, but it's definitely food for thought. Whether you agree with Dugan or not, he makes you think about the world in a whole new light. He opens up possibilities that go beyond what we normally think of as, possible.
Yeah, no kidding. We've explored some deep waters in this part of our dive. From heroic workers to the symbolism of children, from the doctrine of the star to the magical fascist and this aquatic regime. Where do we go from here?
Okay, so we've explored a lot of Dugin's big ideas. Now let's see how he tackles art and literature. He seems really into Charles Baudelaire, the French poet, all that dark, decadent imagery.
Yeah, Baudelaire's a big one for him. Dugan goes deep into his poem, The Swan, all the symbolism, themes of loss and change. It's very alchemical.
He mentions this white widow and the transformation of gold to lead. What's all that about for Dugin?
It's about transmutation, turning something ordinary, even kind of base, into something precious. Finding beauty and meaning in the dark stuff, like alchemy for the soul, for individuals, and even whole societies.
So not just liking morbid poetry, it's about finding something deeper, hidden within the darkness.
Exactly. And Dugin connects this to how European modernity has changed, the bleakness, the despair of modern life. It can be transformed into something richer, what he calls the Black Motherland. Black Motherland? That's
Yeah.
a powerful image. Like there's life hidden in the darkness. A chance for rebirth, something new emerging from the decay.
And this idea of beauty and meaning in the disturbing, the grotesque, it comes up again when Dugin talks about Lautréamont, another French poet known for his really shocking, surreal stuff.
Yeah, Lautréamont's not for everyone. Violence, perversion, this deep sense of alienation. What's Dugin's take on him?
He sees him as someone exploring the abyss, confronting the darkest parts of human nature, all those primal urges we try to hide, ignore. Lautréamont throws them in your face, like a reminder that underneath all the civilized stuff, there's this chaotic, terrifying reality.
So it's not just shock for shock's sake. It's about making us confront our own shadows, those primal urges. They're part of who we are, even if we deny them.
Right. And this confrontation with the irrational, the unknown,
Yeah.
Dugin links it to this Russian concept of the chose.
Mhm.
Hard to translate exactly. It's like this indefinable essence, this mystery at the heart of the Russian soul.
I thought that was such a fascinating idea. Like there's always something more, something just out of reach. You can feel it, but you can't quite put it into words.
Yeah, and Dugin thinks that feeling of mystery, that ambiguity, is really deep in Russian culture.
Yeah.
It's connected to their love of dreams, mysticism, the blurring of what's real and what's not.
Like living in a world that's constantly shifting, the ordinary and extraordinary, the rational and the irrational, all mixed up.
And Dugin takes us even deeper into that world of shadows and dreams when he talks about Yuri Mamlev, this Russian author, part of this underground schizoid movement back in the 60s.
Mamleev's stuff, not for the faint of heart, full of disturbing imagery exploring the deepest, darkest parts of the human psyche. What does Dugin get out of it?
He sees it as theurgic realism, basically using literature to reveal a hidden reality underneath everyday life, those disturbing, surreal stories. He thinks Memley is giving us glimpses of this other side, where logic, morality, all that breaks down.
So not just horror for horror's sake, it's using those elements to point towards something deeper, a truth about reality that's a lot more unsettling.
Exactly. And this exploration of the hidden, the unsettling,
Yeah.
it takes a different turn when Dugin talks about Nikolai Klyev. He was a Russian peasant poet. His vision of Russia was totally different from a lot of the intellectuals of his time.
What sets Klyev apart for Dugin?
It's Klyev's deeply spiritual understanding of Russia. He was like a voice of the Russian soul, embodied that connection to the land, the folk traditions, the rhythms of nature.
And Klyev used the oven a lot in his poems. What does that symbolize for Dugin?
The oven is the heart of the home. Warmth, food, spiritual nourishment. For Dugin, it represents the feminine principle. Nurturing, life-giving, essential for a healthy society. Klyev embracing the oven, it's like rejecting that cold, rational worldview of the Westernized intellectuals.
So for Dugin, Klyev's nationalism is more authentic, rooted in the soil, the seasons, the spiritual traditions of the people.
Right. And Dugin contrasts this with the nationalism of the elite, the intellectuals. Their ideas are more abstract, not grounded in real life. He says true nationalism has to come from experience, living on the land, being part of its people.
Okay, so from Klyev's mystical poetry, we jump to the avant-garde. Dugin talks about Sergei Kuryokin, a composer, performance artist known for his super chaotic, satirical pop mechanics shows.
Kuryokin was a real provocateur, mixing music, theater, absurdist humor, just wild. Dugin connects him to the tradition of the Skomoroks, those old Russian performers who entertained but also, commented on society and even used their performances to induce trance states.
So it's not just entertainment, it's art as a challenge, provoking people, maybe even changing their consciousness.
Exactly. For Dugin, it's about tapping into something more primal, more authentic, breaking free from all those rules of rational thought, getting to a deeper, more intuitive understanding of reality.
Then we're back to literature with Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Dugin sees it as this prophetic text, a way to understand the Russian soul.
He's really into the psychology, the spirituality of Dostoevsky's characters. Raskolnikov killing the old woman. It's not just a crime. It's rebellion against modernity, against a world that's lost its way spiritually.
And he ties it to that idea of the Russian murder, right? That theme of violence and redemption that keeps coming up in Russian history, their literature.
Yeah. He's saying Raskolnikov's act shows this deeper spiritual crisis in the Russian soul, this longing for change, for a total rebirth. And that rebirth can only happen through confronting the darkest parts of yourself, of your society.
And then there's Pimen Karpov. Pretty obscure Russian author, but just as dark and disturbing as L'Autremo.
Dugin sees his novel Flame as this Gnostic vision, a search for this luminous city that's beyond good and evil, beyond religion. He's drawn to how Karpov embraces evil and suffering, like true enlightenment can only come from going into the abyss.
It's a really intense, unsettling vision. But it kind of sums up a lot of what we've been talking about with Dugin. This hidden reality, the importance of the feminine, the search for spiritual transformation, and breaking free from the limits of the modern world.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey through some really complex, controversial stuff.
We've covered so much ground: the metaphysics of Bolshevism, the Chos, the symbolism of the child and the oven, those disturbing visions from L'Autremo and Karpov. We've really gone deep into the darker side of Russian thought, and Dugin isn't afraid to explore it.
It's fascinating how he ties it all together. History, philosophy, mythology, literature, art. He's trying to explain the Russian soul, this longing for meaning, their attraction to extremes, this constant search for a transformative experience.
He definitely gives us a lot to think about, even if we don't always agree with him. What are your big takeaways from all of this? Any figures or ideas that really stuck with you? Anything you want to explore further?
For me, it's a reminder that there are always different ways of seeing things, different ways to understand history, culture, even our own lives. Dugin's work, even though it's challenging, sometimes unsettling, it makes you question what you think you know. It pushes you to look for those hidden currents that shape our reality.
That's a good point. It's easy to get stuck in our own little bubbles, our own way of seeing things. Dugin forces you to step outside of that, consider different perspectives, even if you disagree with them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And maybe, just maybe, that's how we find our own luminous city, our own path to change, to deeper understanding.
Well said. We'll leave you all to think about that, to continue exploring Dugin's world on your own. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.